Mhm.
This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandala Kamniyatayam.
So we can just do the refuge prayer now. Yeah. So here we are thinking we're going to rely upon the Buddha Dhamma Sangha, and we're going to listen to these teachings so that, as it says, we can become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Like stating our motivation is kind of like programs our mind with that very motivation. So that becomes the reason we do this action. So thinking this way. Sangye charan soke chonam la janjo badu dagni kyapsu chi dagi chanyan gipa sonam ki drola penche sangye drupa shog sangye charan soke chonam la janjo badu dagni kyapsu chi dagi chanyan gipa sonam ki drola penche sangye drupa shog. And the third time in English, we go for refuge until we're enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the virtue of listening, the virtuous action of listening to this Dharma, may we all become a Buddha so we can be of benefit to suffering sentient beings. Okay. Thank you very much, Bill. All right, people. We continue our conversation. Is there a particular topic tonight, or is it the general for all of the time we're together?
The particular topic tonight was courageous compassion, but you said
okay,
you
good.
would touch a little bit on karma before you got into that. So
yeah, I think. And what did we discuss last week?
Last week we discussed karma. We discussed the 4 ways that karma ripens.
Okay, good. This is a really good introduction, surprisingly for us, to the talk about compassion. This is a very important thing to really understand. So we know the word compassion. Okay, so we know the word compassion. And we sort of have a general agreement that if we see a dog being harmed or a child or some awful thing happening or a war zone somewhere, then we have compassion for those people. In other words, this is fitting with the Buddhist definition. It begins with this thought: you see suffering and you think, may they not have it. You wish they didn't have it. I think in modern psychology, they make this distinction between empathy and compassion, but I think in Buddhist psychology, it's the same. You read, it's a virtue, it's connected to others' suffering, and then you kind of feel this connection and you wish they didn't have it. And then that can be very strong or very mild, depending on your relationship. So the thing is, though, it's a very limited level of compassion. Because why? Because it's only for victims. Think about it very simply. And they need to be innocent victims, I'm afraid to say. If they're going to get my compassion, and this sounds a bit cynical, analyze it, only if you're an innocent victim, you're a child or an animal or something, and you get harmed by another person. But this is just too limited. I mean, it's too limited because it's an assumption that suffering is only that. So this is why, as His Holiness Dalai Lama says, compassion is not enough. You've got to have wisdom. In other words, and this is why if we understand the Lam Rim, this presentation, this amazing way of presenting the Dharma, according to the Tibetans, this structured way, this is why compassion is more advanced. Because, in other words, we need to have done the first scope and the second scope, which means understand karma and understand our delusions first. Now, the question is why? Because we have to study the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths is in the wisdom wing. The Four Noble Truths is in the first and second scopes. And it's all about one's own suffering. And so right there, the first noble truth, Buddha says there is suffering. Then he says there are causes of it. Number 2. Then he says 3, you can get rid of suffering and its causes. And 4, how to do it. Now, who is he talking to? Not the next door neighbor. He's talking to you. So this is the work we have to do. So the crucial piece here is how to know what suffering is. So as far as he's concerned, the Buddha, and this is the point now, there's the suffering of suffering, which is the first one we all think there is. When you get harmed, poor, war zone, your husband beats you up, you know, you get stolen from. In other words, very simply, the suffering, which is what the Buddha refers to as the suffering of suffering, which is the only suffering we think about. So this is where, if we don't understand the very first stages of practice first, which is the Four Noble Truths, in relation to oneself, it's literally impossible to have the level of compassion that the Bodhisattva path is talking about. It's just like ridiculous. It's impossible. We can't get our heads around it, because we know on the Bodhisattva path, we know from studying the Lam Rim and from trying to meditate and all this, you know, Tonglen and all this business, that Buddha's talking about how everybody is suffering. So if you don't first understand for yourself exactly what suffering is and think about it and meditate on it and then want to be free of it, how can you possibly have compassion for others? It is literally impossible. We just don't understand what Buddha's talking about. We kind of think, well, I just got to, you know, everyone's suffering, so I'm just going to have compassion for everyone. But you've got to be much more precise about it than that. So let's look at the suffering of change. We already talked about it. Maybe we didn't label it that. But basically, the first kind of suffering, as far as Buddha is concerned, is when the bad things happen. So even if you're just thinking this human life, you know, when the bad things happen, that's what we call suffering. And then we spend all our time trying to avoid it, you know, for ourselves. We can't stand it. But what about the second kind? And this is where we get to the second scope, the middle scope of the Lam Rim, and we start to discuss the Buddha's analysis of the delusions, because these are the source of our problem. This is the source of why we even create karma, because our mind drives everything. And this is where we try to understand Buddha's presentation of the human mind. We discussed last week how we have deluded neurotic states of mind, and then we have the virtuous ones. So here, what Buddha means by the suffering of change is what we literally mean by happiness. So in ordinary worldly terms, we know this so well. Look at the world, look at the dogs and monkeys and humans, we're all the same. All we try to do is avoid the bad things happening, which is the suffering of suffering. And all we try to do is get the good things to happen, which we call happiness, but which Buddha calls an even subtler, more pervasive, more heavy-duty level of suffering. So, of course, this is shocking to us. On the face of it, it sounds like really not fair. Buddha's sounds like miserable, not even allowed to enjoy your cake, you know? So we have to understand what he's talking about. And this just takes time. This takes analysis. It takes a lot of clarity to really think this through. But on the face of it, the first level of it is really quite evident. And I don't remember if we discussed it last week. So you start off with suffering, okay? Suffering of suffering. And that's, in this scenario, let's say, getting the chocolate cake. The first is you're hungry, so it's a very mild level of the suffering of suffering. You feel uncomfortable, you're hungry, so it's called the suffering of suffering. I mean, just a simple level. So what do? You think, I'm going to get the cake, and you get all excited. Then attachment kicks in, and then you start to exaggerate the deliciousness of the cake, which is attachment's job. Then you get the cake, and there it is, and you're anticipating the cake, and then you put the cake in the mouth. And of course, what it does do, and I think we did discuss this last week, what it does do is definitely trigger happy feelings. Buddha doesn't argue with that, but this is the point now. It's more subtle. It's harder to see it. You've got to contemplate it. You've got to look carefully at it. It seems it triggers a happy feeling, and Buddha agrees it does trigger a happy feeling. But this is the point, and we all know this. Attachment is right there at the moment of the first mouthful, all excited, anticipating the happy feeling. The happy feeling comes, but attachment's not satisfied. So attachment is still distressed. It's not content. So you need to have a second mouthful, hoping that the pleasure will come again. And then, you know, you're not thinking about it. You just, oh, this is cake, wow, 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 and you eat and eat and eat. And before you know it, the third piece comes, and now your mind is quite distressed. You're feeling a bit stuffed. Your stomach is full. The cake doesn't even look so delicious anymore. And you try to get some pleasure. You're hoping maybe the next mouthful really will give you that pleasure that attachment is constantly anticipating. But we know it's revolting, and you have to stop eating. Otherwise, you would vomit. Well, this whole scenario, starting off with pleasure, the pleasure with each mouthful getting less until eventually it turns into disgust. This is the suffering. This is the suffering of change. And this is what in samsara we call happiness. And actually, and it's quite distressing, it's the only way we know how to trigger happy feelings. But they don't last. Now, we know this so well, but it kind of, we go, well, yeah, we know that, Buddha. Why are you telling us it doesn't last? Why is that meant to make us kind of go, wow, I want to give it up? This is what's fascinating. It's because attachment, because we crave happiness, we want happiness, we're trying to find it the whole time. We're looking here, we're looking there, we look somewhere else, we try a new husband, we try a new handbag, we try this, we try that, we try a new job, we try a new shape of our body. We're always looking for happiness. And because of attachment, we're always assuming it'll come when we get that new thing or that new cake or the cake tomorrow, and that's the default assumption. It's completely programmed in us from the Buddha's point of view for countless lifetimes of practicing it. So we're basically all junkies. We're basically junkies. Attachment is really the mind of a junkie. And we're all junkies. I'm not being sarcastic. It's just a question of object and it's a question of degree. That's all. That's the suffering of attachment, you know. I mean, if you're an alcoholic, it's evident. This suffering is evident. If you're, it's really evident it's not going to work. If you're attached to, you read about people attached to sex. I remember one fellow went to sex AA or whatever it's called, I might have mentioned this. And there he is he said, having sex with one girl, already anticipating the next one. So that's what's happening in our mind when we have the cake, when we have whatever it is, but we have to start paying attention to it. And we have to ask the question, why aren't we satisfied with the pleasure that was triggered by the first mouthful? Because when we analyze it afterwards, we go back over the experience, you're going to find that pleasure was the best. It can only go downhill from there. But we keep bashing our heads against brick walls for countless lives, Buddha says. So this really demands looking. It's not being cynical. We just think Buddha's being mean, We have to understand it, because how can you want to give up that suffering if you don't recognize that suffering? And this, of course, is the tragedy, that tomorrow you forget all about the stuffed stomach, you forget all about the acid reflux, you forget all about the unhappy feelings, but you forget that the very cake that you first believed was going to bring you happiness, pleasant feelings, ends up bringing you revolting feelings, unless you stop after the first mouthful. But this is samsara. This is the tragedy, because the fact is, it is impossible to become satisfied by following attachment. This is Buddha's entire teaching. So we really need to look at this carefully. So then we're a bit distressed because we think, well, what choice have we got? We all want to be happy. What am I supposed to do, Buddha? And speaking very simply, all he's really saying is, listen, guys, I found a method of how to get happy feelings that will not change into unhappy feelings. That's really what he's saying. But it takes a while to deduce that. He is saying, basically, you people think happy feelings are what you get when you get what attachment wants. No, he said, I have found that happy feelings are what you get when you give up attachment. This is Buddha's deal. So the point is this, from even this point of view of the second kind of suffering, when you know this for yourself, then you look at the world, you suddenly have compassion for everybody on the planet, because everybody is caught up in this nightmare. Everybody. It's not just the bad things happening, it's this more subtle level of suffering. So there's a third level of suffering, even more subtle, even more pervasive, that underpins the other two. This is the main suffering, but it's so subtle, it's hard for us to even comprehend it. And that's called all pervasive suffering. So it's a bit like, you know, you've got attachment, which is the mind of a junkie. And of course, if you're a junkie, you need the junk. You've got to have an object called heroin, just using the analogy. So the object of attachment is all the things in the world. Sound, smells, tastes, cakes, people, food, handbags, money, you name it, you name it, you name it. You know, we're living. So in other words, the all-pervasive suffering is having this mind in the first place, this deluded mind of attachment, which then, of course, underpinned by ego grasping. You're compelled, because of your past karma, to be born in a world made of heroin, which is the sensory objects. You've got no choice. So having a mind that's the mind of a junkie, being born in a world where everything is made of heroin. And to survive, you have to ingest the heroin. So in other words, attachment is the junkie mind, and the objects of attachment, the entire sensory world, that's the heroin. So that's being caught up in it, that you've got no choice. To survive, you've got to ingest heroin. That's all pervasive suffering, being born in samsara. So the solution to the first kind of suffering is stop harming others. So you stop the future suffering for yourself, the gross suffering. The solution to the second kind of suffering is give up attachment. And the solution to the third kind of suffering is realize emptiness. Then you're out of samsara altogether. So knowing all this for yourself, which is the first and second scope of practice and the Four Noble Truths, now you have a basis for being revolted by samsara and wanting to get the hell out of samsara for yourself. That's called renunciation. This is the basis for our ability to begin to develop this compassion for every single sentient being in all the realms of existence, because we're all in the same boat. So if you don't understand the Four Noble Truths and you don't understand the three kinds of suffering, you do not understand the level of compassion that we're describing, that Lord Buddha describes on the Mahayana path. It's as simple as that. You can only get so far, you know. Your compassion is limited. So that's the essence of the background to why you need to do the wisdom wing first and second scopes, in order to qualify you to even begin to develop these outrageous levels of compassion. And, you know, so why courageous compassion? Because really the level of compassion we're describing is fierce, extraordinary when you've got it, when you're in your bodhisattva, you know, because you've got this fierce attitude, the bodhisattvas, and they've accomplished it, of you never give up. The key factor of bodhicitta is never give up. Bodhicitta is not the equivalent of compassion. It's the culmination of extraordinary levels of the development of virtue and goodness and love and compassion. So it manifests as this powerful kind of like aspiration. There's two parts to bodhicitta. One is, excuse me, I have to have a drink. Hang on a second. The first attitude of a bodhisattva is that whoever's in front of you, they're your responsibility. And that includes every single sentient being. The pedophile, the wacko, the torturer, you know, the child, the dog, whoever, they're your responsibility. How can I help? What can I do to stop their suffering? Automatically, there's no question, spontaneous. Second was the long-term, fierce attitude of never giving up as many lives as it takes for you to go from life to life to life, continually benefiting others. In other words, and then creating the virtue, the merit, and the wisdom to eventually become a Buddha. Never giving up. And this is the fierce, courageous, outrageous attitude of the bodhisattvas. I mean, you hear Lamas Rinpoche talking, you know, you hear these bodhisattvas talking, and it's kind of hard to even imagine that level of compassion, you know. I mean, when they talk, they mean it seriously. But all sentient beings, all the hell rings, all the animals, all the humans, all the gods. I mean, when you hear Lamas Rinpoche, you know it's coming straight from his experience, you know. It's hard to even imagine. It's kind of like exhausting almost. It's so powerful, you know. But you've got to go one step at a time, of course. Like all these teachings, they're incremental, they're step by step. You can't just leap into this level of compassion. It's simply impossible. So what are the steps? Well, we know very well, the compassion wing. It's these series of techniques, these two sets of techniques. One is called the 6 causes and 1 effect or something, and the other one's called, is the Lojong one. They both come to the same thing. So let's look at some of the series, some of the points of practices in this series of techniques. And Pabonka Rinpoche puts them together. Again, he combines them, and there are 11 little techniques all together. So the first one is already huge. It really takes us a while to think about it and understand it, because it doesn't make sense to us. So remember, the whole purpose of all these points is to lead us to this paradigm shift in our mind, where we have unbearable, as Lama Zopa calls it, unbearable compassion for every living being. I mean, this is sort of exhausting, This is why the wisdom wing is so important first. Because if we're hearing this teaching now, let's say, and we haven't done much of the work on our own mind, we feel overwhelmed and we're in a terrible relationship and people are mean to us and the boss is horrible, and there's no space. This is the whole point. There's no space to think about compassion for others. It's exhausting. I mean, please go away, because we're not ready. We've got to be, as Pabonka Rinpoche says, we need to be a suitable vessel to begin these discussions, to begin these techniques for developing this incredible levels of compassion. So you've got to have the wisdom wing, and that's why we'd call that, in our terms, that's like the self-compassion first, which is the developing renunciation, understanding karma, understanding your delusions and wanting to give them up because you're sick of suffering. This has to come first. The more powerful that is, the more capable you are of these levels of compassion, and these incremental steps, So given that we're trying to develop love and compassion for every single suffering being, the very first point is to establish that they all want to be happy and they all want to be free from suffering. This is the starting point. So this is why this equanimity is so important. Right now, because we've got the 3 poisons, and so the objects of 3 poisons in terms of sentient beings, the first one is friends. So we've got all our beloveds, our friends, our people we like, people we're attached to. Maybe some, maybe a few people, maybe one, who knows? So they're the so-called friend. So right now, they're the only ones we really have compassion for. They're the only ones that we really love. So love is, may you be happy. Compassion is, may you not suffer. These are the definitions, basically. So that's really only for this first group. We're preoccupied with our families and our dogs and our kids and our grandkids, and they're the ones we are thinking about all the time. Of course, this is just life. It's normal. Everyone has families, and they're the ones we think about, or our partners or whatever. So our love and compassion is there, but it's really limited. It's only for, that was a big yawn. Better mute yourself, honey. It wasn't a yawn. Maybe it was exhausting hearing what I'm saying. It's probably true, Deborah. You're exactly right. It is a big yawn. So, you have so then attachment has the object called friend, and we have love for them, we have compassion for them, but it's also quite exhausting, isn't it? Because they're the ones often that when they stop doing, and basically our love, in other words, our love, Lama Zopa says, our love and compassion at the moment are unstable because they're based on attachment. So and this is the point about attachment, as long as you do what my attachment wants, which means as long as you make me happy and do what, then I'm prepared to have love and compassion for you. And it's so this is such an absolute view. It seems almost shocking to think that you should love anybody apart from the one who loves you. It's quite hard to hear this. It's quite intense. So in this equanimity one, so what we're trying to do is establish everybody wants this. So there's a second group of people, and they're called enemy. Now, we mightn't use that word, but it means the object of our aversion, even our anger. And who's that? That, by definition, is the person who doesn't do what my attachment wants. The ex-husband, the mean boss, the unkind people, ones who do mean things to me. So necessarily they're the ones who don't do what my attachment wants and even do what my attachment doesn't want. And they're in the enemy category. And we don't have love and compassion for them. We almost wish they'd suffer, when it's really much anger, isn't it? So what about the third group? That's called stranger, and that's 99.99% of the universe. And how do we feel about them? Well, that's complete and total indifference, isn't it? I mean, pretty much. This sounds very shocking, quite brutal, but it's a fact, because we're all driven by these three poisons: enemy in relation to sentient beings, enemy, friend, and stranger. So we adore the friend and love and have compassion for them as long as they keep doing what we want. We do not adore and do not love and do not have compassion for the enemies. We wish they'd all just go away. And we don't care about the stranger. Why? Because they neither help us nor harm us. So therefore indifferent. But this is, so we think about it, it's sort of normal. But it's a bit shocking to hear like it's some kind of problem, but this is life, we'll say. This is just normal life. And it is normal life. This is how monkeys and dogs and ants and humans have been behaving since beginningless time. So what are we trying to do here? Well, because at the moment we do have love and compassion, but it's limited and it's unstable. And as we'd say, it's got strings attached. The logical reason I love somebody now, I want them to be happy, is because they make me happy. And the logical reason I have compassion, which is want them not to suffer, is because they probably have compassion for me. But all we're trying to do here is shift the logic for why we would want to develop love and compassion for everybody from because they deserve it to because they all want it. Everybody, we're trying to establish here. It's a fairly fundamental point. It's hard for us to see it. Everybody only wants happy feelings and nobody wants suffering feelings. Now, we kind of technically know that, but as soon as you hear that, let's say your ex-husband's been really brutal and unkind and cheated on you and is horrible, and this, this is an example, and then you hear, well, my ex-husband wants to be happy too. We don't want to know about that. It's too painful to us because the first thing we say, he doesn't deserve it. This is massive for us. In other words, our love and compassion is contingent on whether somebody deserves it. And of course, a person who deserves my love is a person who gives me love. So it's very, very self-centered. We can see this, but it's kind of shocking to see it, So we're trying to shift that to try and simply recognize it. Equanimity is not the development of love and compassion yet. That comes gradually. This is just setting the ground. Shifting our view from seeing the beloveds, the uglies, and the borings to seeing, oh my God, they are all the same. And this is what equanimity is. Equanimity is quite precise. It's not love and compassion. Each of these steps leads you incrementally. And this is it's like getting our groundwork clear. We're trying to establish the bare, simple fact that every friend, every enemy, every stranger only wants happy feelings, only doesn't want unhappy feelings. And it's got zero here to do with deserve. It's just trying to see the fact. This is already tremendous. Huge shift if we can begin to see the logic of this. And then we gradually build up on that with all the next series of points in attempting to actually have love and compassion for them. But one step at a time. We have to use lots of logic to argue with ego's ridiculous misconceptions. These meditations are very intensive and they demand a lot of analysis, clear logical analysis to shift ego's view. They're not just gooey feelings we're trying to get. It's very simple. It's how we think of love and compassion now is very superficial. It's like a few feelings. It's got to be using logic because ego is completely irrational. Completely illogical, We've got to use different logic here to try and prove this fact to us. I think one example is a very good one. One example, visualize in front of you to the left in front of you, a beloved. To the right in front of you, middle, an enemy. And to the right in front of you, a stranger. Just a face that you know enough to put them there, but it's not affected your life. Friend, enemy, stranger. Now, but do a different thing here. It's a different way. Now, look at each one and look at your friend looking at you, and they adore you. So for them, you are their friend. They're looking at you. They adore you. You know, especially people who really love us. They look at you with such love and affection. Look in their eyes, and you can see that what they're seeing is friend. You know, friend. They see you. You can see their eyes looking at you. They adore you. So they have attachment for you. And then, of course, they have love and compassion for you because you're their friend. It's this label they put on you. Now, look into the eyes of this enemy. Maybe you, with your ex-husband, you cheated on him. You were mean. You were horrible to him. Maybe you lied to him. You stole from him. Who knows? A person who doesn't like you because you have harmed them, or even they perceive you to have harmed them. Look at them. They're looking at daggers at you, aren't they? Think what I'm saying. They're looking daggers at you, and all they see is enemy, ugly, horrible. Don't want to look at you. Don't even want to hear your name. That's enemy, isn't it? Now, now to the right, look to the right in front of you. There's a stranger whom you don't know well enough. And basically they're looking at you, but they're bored to tears because you've neither helped them nor harmed them. So you are their stranger. So the friend thinks you're divine, the enemy thinks you're horrible, and the stranger thinks you're boring. Get my point now. So if they each wrote down a description of what they were seeing, you would not recognize. There'd be completely three descriptions, wouldn't it? Because you're friend for one, enemy for another, stranger for the third. So what's the point I'm getting at? The point is this. It's very simple. All we're trying to prove is the point. You know yourself. You don't feel like a friend 1 minute and an enemy the next and boring the next. That's their projections. It's completely their projections onto you, isn't it? You just feel like you are, you know. Now, let's say you've got a headache. Let's say you've got a headache. You know perfectly well that, you know, as a stranger, this person looks at you bored, your headache's awful. Do you enjoy your headache, Robina? No, it's terrible. And you're a stranger. Now, suddenly you're an enemy. How's your headache? It's exactly the same headache. It's awful. And what if your beloved looks at you? A friend looks at you because you're a friend. Oh, how's your headache, Robina? It's awful. So in other words, you're a friend 1 minute, stranger the next, enemy the next. Your headache is exactly the same headache, and you only want to not suffer every second, and you only want to be happy every second. It's got nothing to do with these three projections from these three people, enemy, friend, and stranger. It doesn't define you in your own bones at all. Well, just switch around to the world, and that's how the world is. Yes, somebody did harm you, and there's somebody is kind to you, and yes, somebody did neither, but that's not what defines the simple fact that they each want to be happy and each don't want suffering, and that friend, enemy, stranger are just labels we all dump on each other. They've got no real sound basis, but we use them as the absolute basis for whether we love or have compassion for somebody, isn't it? So as soon as you see the guy kick the dog, you have compassion for the dog and you hate the guy. As soon as you see a war somewhere, depending on which side you're on, one group is the victim and the other group are the wicked ones. We live our lives like this. We're seeing enemies, we're seeing friends, we see strangers, we're constantly labeling. These are the three fundamental labels. And if you think about it, there's no fourth category on the planet. There are the objects of attachment who appear divine to us, whom we do adore and have compassion for. Then the objects of our aversion, who are the ugly ones, the mean politicians, the ex-husbands, the horrible warmongers, the rapists, the pedophiles, you name it. And then the boring people, the strangers. We couldn't care less about them. We have aversion to the middle lot and we adore the first lot. I mean, no wonder we're exhausted. And they keep changing position. If I'm in love with Bill, one day he's a stranger and I couldn't care less. He could drop dead as far as I'm concerned. There's another way of thinking about friend, enemy, stranger. So let's say Bill's a stranger. I've never met the bloke, but he has migraines. Well, I couldn't care less. I hear about Bill and his migraines. Oh, does he really? The poor fellow? Change the subject. Give me the tea, please. Yeah, I mean, I don't know the fellow. I don't know him. So it's really hard, isn't it, to even think compassionately for more than a minute because he's a stranger. Now, I move in with Bill and we fall in love. And now suddenly he's moved over from the enemy, from the stranger, to the friend category. And now look at the compassion I've got for him. People say, oh, Robina's got so much compassion. She takes care of Bill with his migraine. She spends all her money. She gets him doctors. She thinks about him day and night, as if I'm suddenly so compassionate. Well, what happened when he had a headache, when he was my enemy, when my stranger? I couldn't have cared less then. Suddenly I'm all caring. I mean, it's obviously contingent on attachment. His headaches were just as bad when he was my stranger, but I didn't care. And then he cheats on me, and now he goes to the enemy category, and I hope he suffers with his migraines, don't I? We know this. We just don't join the dots because these labels are so powerful, because these are just the three poisons Lord Buddha's telling us. So we're trying to get beyond the logic, the illogic of ego, and try to be more objective and simply recognize the scientific fact. Everybody is driven, yearning, hungry for happy feelings and can't stand unhappy feelings. That's the thing we're trying to prove here. And this is pretty powerful already, because you're basically getting yourself out of the equation, you know. Right now, we just define the entire, and this is very brutal, but it's true, we define the entire world in terms of whether or not they satisfy my needs. We don't care about the ones who do neither. We don't like the ones who are unkind, and we adore the ones who do satisfy my needs. So we're driven by attachment. I mean, we should be embarrassed. It's so self-centered, but it's completely normal. This is the world. This is just the world, you know, as we know, we can see it. So to really think about this and step out of the equation and try to recognize that those three labels, like in your own case, friend, enemy, stranger, each minute the label changes. You just feel like the same person. You know, it's meaningless, people's labels on top of you, projecting all the time, isn't it? So any questions about all what I've talked about so far? Nearly 1 hour has gone by. Any questions, please, about the necessity, especially, to understand the Four Noble Truths for yourself before you really move into the teachings on compassion? I'd like some discussion now.
Venerable, I've got a question.
Yeah.
With all pervasive suffering,
Yeah.
I've never heard it described that way before, so thank you for that.
Well, how do you understand it?
Well, I never did.
I see. It's basically having delusions and being born in samsara in the first place, and because of that being compelled to continue to buy into samsara. That's why to realize emptiness is the only way to stop being. It's basically being born in samsara.
That's what I was going to say. So effectively, those three types of suffering pretty much mirror the three poisons, right?
No. Yes, you could argue. Well,
because aversion, you have
no. Well, I mean, no. The three levels of practice, you could say. The very first one is giving up harming others, and that stops your future suffering, which is karma, junior school, first scope. The second scope, you now look into delusions, in particular attachment, and you start to see the suffering of change. So getting renunciation of a samsara, giving up attachment, that's a solution to the suffering of change. And then finally realizing emptiness in when you get to the 6 perfections and you realize emptiness, that cuts all the suffering. That's why Buddha argued where he diverged from the Hindu position. Rinpoche says, they already discovered the suffering of suffering, and solutions to it. They already discovered the suffering of change and the solutions to it. No, they didn't. That one, for them, this even just going to the God realms is like, that's for the Christians. That's that's happiness. But for the Buddha, that is still in samsara, because it's blissful, but it'll end. And then even the form and formless realms for the Hindus, the subtlest level, they say, is liberation. You still are in samsara. You've still got this, some level of the suffering of change. You haven't discovered the method to get rid of all suffering, which means being born in samsara. So that's why realizing it. This means conditioned suffering is being born in samsara, basically. I mean, you might have a life in samsara that hasn't got much suffering of change and hasn't got much suffering of suffering, but you've still got the all-pervasive suffering. You're still in the highest realms and where it seems like you're completely blissed out, but you're still in samsara. You haven't
But it
realized
would
it.
still be pretty much the opposite of the perfection of wisdom is
Well,
that
I
level
don't think about it like that. Don't.
of
That just makes it complicated. It just means
overcomplicates it.
so. Yeah, I mean, from what we're discussing, how are you understanding all pervasive suffering or conditioned suffering? Where are you understanding it?
Well, I think I am, but I
No, but
guess
say the word.
I'm trying
Say
to
the word. But say the word.
find patterns. I think I'm just allowing my mind to find patterns where there might be not a pattern.
No, that's just meaningless. Just try and just give me the name of the. Just explain to me what you think the suffering of all pervasive suffering is.
From
this
I
discussion.
would just be repeating what you just said.
That's fine, but say it.
The idea of the fact that I'm in this body with this mind and
Of delusions.
of delusions
Perpetuating future suffering.
perpetuating the other two types.
That's what all pervasive suffering is.
Yeah.
Suffering is an extra bad life. Suffering of change is like having a nice life, a relatively nice life, but then the suffering, all pervasive is being born in one or the other endlessly because you have. So the solution to that one is realizing emptiness. So when you understand the solution, it tells you the type of suffering it is, which is being caught up in being born from one life to another. Do you understand?
Yes.
Okay, so it's one step at a time. That's why first we've got to stop the suffering of suffering and stop harming others. Then we've got to give up attachment, which is the suffering of change. You can't, and then you've got to realize emptiness. So it's gradual, incremental levels of practice. It's very intelligent. The Lam Room's all laid out perfectly for this. Do you understand? Okay, good. What else, people? Yeah, people. Something. Ask me a question about compassion, about equanimity. Equanimity, you'd say more about compassion or something. People. So equanimity is the starting point. It's the starting point. It's the start. It's the basis. Because you're shifting from only wanting friends to be happy and not suffer to everybody. But we haven't got there yet. It was just this bare bones recognition. They all want to be happy. So the next little step, as we know in the Lam Rim, is to kind of like this concept of it's getting your mind to be a little bit vast. And to acknowledge this continuity of consciousness going back and back and back, and everybody sentient being you've ever met going back and back and back. We've all had countless lifetimes. So it's sort of like to expand our mind a little bit, just to think we've all met each other in countless lifetimes, and they've all been our mother. So the only reason for this is because it's an example of a person who's nurtured us and loved us. So the third point is, there's 2 points there. Let's discuss this one. There's 2 points in the thirds of these 11 points. The first one is the mother is kind. We need to contemplate the kindness of the mother. So in our culture, that's really, really quite difficult because there's a very strong tendency to not like our mums, to blame them for all the suffering. And that fits with our model of the world. Your parents make you, so of course it's their fault. So this is quite a huge one for us. And I'll discuss the second one in a minute, but this first one's really, I think it's quite powerful for our minds, because if you have the view that your mother made you, which is the materialist view, then in a sense it's true. You didn't ask to get born. I didn't ask to get born. It's not my fault. We say that as a joke, but it's deadly serious. And it underpins the way we feel. So if you've got a creepy mum who's attached and possessive and neurotic, or didn't take care of you properly, or whatever, which is common, you're going to have, because guess what? She's in samsara. Then it's so shocking to us in our world. It's so shocking. We have such a deep assumption, which is attachment, that you should have a good mother. We almost like that's like a religious truth, I think. It's deep in our bones, which is why in our psychological models, it's always so shocking when you had a bad mother, because that explains all the suffering we have. That's how we think. Well, this view is quite different. When you have the view of karma, and you've got this particular mother, you've had this mother countless times, and you've been her mum countless times, it's a very different way of seeing it. It's a very different context, and you have the view of karma, then you already know that you play a major role in being born to that specific mother. You're not some victim that was plonked on this planet. It's a very, very, very different viewpoint. And it therefore brings a very different result in the way you think, So I think it's important for us to do this. But the other thing is this. how to think of the kindness of the mother. First of all, I think our use of the word kind. If you say, oh, she's so kind, what we mean is she does nice things for me. For me, not my next door neighbor, not the dog. She can be mean to me and kind to 4 million people. I do not care. So we say she's so kind, we mean she does what I want. She does what my attachment wants, whoever that person is in the planet, you know. That's pretty intense. That's our view. That's what we think. So then you have your mum, who's a bit neurotic and she's a bit mean and didn't feed you properly and was a bit bad-tempered maybe. Then we are shocked. What do you mean she was kind? She wasn't kind. So this is the thing here. We learned this back in the middle scope. Our delusions, attachment and anger, exaggerate. So when you've got I can think of myself with my mum. When I was a little girl, it's like I was in love with my mother. You're full of attachment. Your mother's like this perfect person. I remember as a little girl telling people, the kids at school, I was so proud because my mother had 2 university degrees in music. And I sort of acted like she was the goddess on the planet, like she was the most special person, unique. And one girl scoffed, well, who cares? Sort of thing. I was shattered because I really believed my mother was like the special saint who was, I mean, we all are like that as little children. But I remember vividly, and this is the point, all attachment was there, so your mother looks divine. But as you start to get older and more rebellious, gradually your mother starts to annoy you. And before you know it, your mother falls off the pedestal and all you do is find fault with your mother. And I remember the moment I found fault with my mother. I was shocked, like I'd committed a big sin. And before you know it, all I can do is see bad things. And then the rest of your life, many people never give up that anger towards their mother. They hate their mother till the day they die. So what delusions do, in the beginning, attachment exaggerates your mother's beauty because she wasn't that perfect. And then aversion kicks in and you start finding fault. And then you paint your mother with the brush of anger. And that's the tragedy of these delusions, you know. So the fact that here is a very powerful technique is to simply learn to paint a new picture of your mother. It's a good start, I tell you. I mean, to think of some of the things she did for you. So kind here is a crucial point. Kind here is not meaning, you know, she did what you wanted. Kind is the fact that she did anything at all to help you. So your mother wiped your bottom. Your mother gave birth to you. Your mother, if your mother even got you in the orphanage, you know, she bought you, you know, my God, she actually chose you, even if you think she's a creepy mum. Or your mother maybe didn't have an abortion. That's pretty powerful. I remember at the time I had an abortion when I was in my 20s, and one of my friends or somebody, she was younger, and I said, oh, have an abortion, it's easy. Come on, don't worry, have an abortion, have an abortion. I remember she consciously decided she wouldn't have an abortion. She had the baby, risked losing her boyfriend, and then gave the baby away. So I know her motivation was really didn't want to knock off this little kid. You know, I'm not being rude. And I know that that mother met the child later and she was always resentful to her. But she didn't know her reasons. She didn't know her motivation. And she was really compassionate. She chose not to abort her. That's a pretty powerful, kind action, I would say. But the child didn't know that. She just moans and complains. And very many feel they've been rejected by their mother. So there's various things we've got to look at freshly. Your mother fed you, wiped your bottom, showed you how to tie your shoelaces, dressed you, looked after you when you cried and yelled. She mightn't be the perfect mother, but the fact that she didn't kill you and did a few things even for you is a reason to see a different picture of your mum. She was kind. This is a very powerful practice, I promise you. And it's simply in your mind or on a piece of paper, writing down the things that your mother must have done. But we, of course, take them all for granted. It's her job. Why would I say she's kind, you know? But you're painting a new picture. It's very profound. I know many of my friends, Buddhists, you do that and you've got a whole new relationship with your mother. And she is neurotic. Yes, no one says she's not. She is self-centered. Yes, no one says she's not. But this is still not the point. It's very profound, I tell you. That's the kindness of the mother. Then the second one in the same point, number 3, is the second one. It's said to be more profound. And this is a really powerful one. And even initially, this is like a joke. This one goes, all beings are kind. You go, don't be ridiculous. What does this mean? But this is basically dependent arising. So if you think about from the time you were conceived up until now, this is my way of putting it, every tiny thing that facilitated your life from the time of conception is the result of the handiwork of sentient beings. That's a fact. It's dependent arising. The mother feeding you in her womb. You would not be alive if she hadn't fed you those cows and chickens and fishes and peas and carrots and tomatoes. So your little body that comes out after 7 or 8 or 9 months is a body of cows and fishes and chickens, you know, the kinds of all those sentient beings whose flesh your mother ate, that went into her body, that turned into your body. This is incredible, but we take it for granted, you know. Then when you came out of the womb, she took care of you and she clothed you and she wiped your little bottom and kept you safe and put you in bed and picked you up, and otherwise you would have died. And then the food you ate, the creatures whose food you ate, all the people who worked for you to help you. This is a fact. The clothes you wear, the glasses you wear. I mean, I'd be blind as a bat without my glasses. And these clever opticians have created all these fancy lenses, because my eyes are very like +13 in this eye. And it'd be like a saucer, thick glass. And then they've invented nice thin ones. Everything is the handiwork of sentient beings. This is scientific fact. But because we never think about it, we don't notice. We take it for granted. You walk in the shop, assuming it's your right that people be kind to you and give you the food you want with the best price. I mean, look at them. I always think of just, you know, getting a jar of jam. These are facts. This is scientific fact. It's not religion. The number of people involved. First of all, this on the shelf. Someone made the shelf in the supermarket. And then there's a price thing on it with all the percentage, what you pay is this and that. Then you look on the label, then it's all about the amount of nutrition or lack of nutrition and sugar in this and blah, blah, blah. You wouldn't know otherwise. And then someone printed that label. Someone made the paper. People in the factory. Someone printed it. Someone made the ink. Someone did the typography. Someone did the proofreading. Someone, you know, cut the label at the dye factory. They put it on they cut the dye for it. They put it on the jar. Someone made the lid. Someone made the jar. Someone made all the jam. All the sentient beings who died when the jam was picked. I mean, think about it. It's coming from many, many sources. This is not religion. This is fact. But we never think about it. This should be enough to really blow our minds, to realize the millions of sentient beings involved in just me staying alive. But we take it for granted. I mean, the hubris of it is extraordinary, you know. We have to think about this. We know, we hear it, it's logical, but we have to think about it, remind ourselves. When we see your iPhone, you see your little thing, you see this, you see your computer, you see that, you see your mug, you see your glasses, you see it, and you see the handiwork of sentient beings. It's very profound, I tell you. So the fourth one is a conclusion. I must repay their kindness. It's a conclusion from this contemplating the kindness of sentient beings, you know. One step at a time, like that, yeah. Look, it's time to go home already. Oh no, it's 1 hour. We're okay. Nearly an hour. Okay, so I need more. Any more questions, perhaps, or any questions at all? Please see if there's any questions. Sort of blow my nose. Any questions, people? Nothing in the chat, Bill? Marilyn, come on, you must have a question, Marilyn. You sure you haven't got a question?
Roy has a question.
Roy, okay, good. Talk to me, Roy.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
It's not my question, but
Go on.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Yeah, I'm at the back of the room, so I wasn't
Okay,
sure.
good, Roy. Talk to me.
I have a question. I'm exploring this concept of all-pervasive suffering.
Yes.
The only antidote for that is essentially, as I understand it, the acquisition of wisdom, or letting go of what's the term escaping me now? the realization of emptiness.
That's right, precisely. That's the antidote.
So
That cuts all the suffering in all the realms of existence. So it's called all pervasive because it covers all of the suffering. You
Right.
mightn't always have the suffering of suffering. You mightn't always have the suffering of change, but you'll, as long as you're reborn, as long as you believe in an intrinsic me, you'll always have some kind of rebirth. So that's all pervasive suffering. Cutting it is the realization of emptiness. Absolutely.
So I guess I'm just inverting what you just said, but so once one achieves that, basically you have, at that point you escape samsara and escape rebirth. Is that?
That's right. That's right. Precisely. You don't need to be reborn. But if you're on the Mahayana path, you want to be reborn for the sake of others. So we're talking the wisdom wing here, the Hinayana teachings, the teachings we share with the Theravadan path, because emptiness is a Hinayana teaching. You know, if you were on the wisdom wing only, you'd go to first scope, you'd abide by the laws of karma, you'd control your body and speech. You go to the second scope, you get renunciation of attachment, and then you'd get shamatha, and then you'd realize emptiness, and then eventually one life or other, you will perfect that realization. And at the end of that life, because your motivation for countless lives is to get out of samsara, you won't come back. You'll go to a subtle state of bliss. If you're on the Mahayana path, you go through the same stages even, but you will come back because you want to become a Buddha. So even if you don't need to be reborn, you will still continue to want to be reborn, to be a benefit to others.
So am I correct to assume that one can from time to time experience the direct realization of emptiness in a transient way? And if that's true, does one then in those transient periods escape that?
No, not like that. If you have an actual non-conceptual direct insight into the fact that there never has been, isn't, and never could be an inherent I, and you've perfected that realization, it is impossible to lose that realization. That's the whole point. You literally cut the root, and therefore samsara cannot grow again. That's the point. We can have tastes of emptiness. We can have tastes that we must have. Intellectually, we must every time have, but that eventually has to manifest in your deepest meditation, in shamatha meditation, a direct non-conceptual insight into that fact. That's a very powerful, and the very first moment of that realization, you can't fall back after that. You're finished. You've got more work to do, but you can't fall back into samsara after that.
Okay. Thank you.
But we can't, what the Lord Buddha would say, we've had shamatha, we've had single pointed concentration countless lifetimes, but we haven't used it to realize emptiness. Okay, right.
Yeah, thank you.
Good. What else, people? Any questions? Nothing. So the next series of points then on these 11, I won't go through them all. The next point, the 5th onwards, is shifting now to the Lojong component. So I think really here what we'll do is go briefly through the 8 verses of mind transformation. This amazing, simple little text by this Tibetan Lungri Tongpa that actually was kept secret in the beginning, you know, with Atisha. He brought these teachings with him from India and from Sumatra, where he was with his guru Salingpa for many years. And they were kept secret because they're so opposite to the ordinary world, you know. So with this text, I think they began to become more public. So these 8 verses all sound so simple and cute and short and, you know, but kind of, they're pretty intense. And this is the essence of this whole approach of transforming, you know, the problems into happiness and seeing bad things as good and seeing harmful people as good, as the quickest method to smash ego, to smash self-cherishing, and also makes it easier to realize emptiness. So this term self-cherishing is quite specific. In general, in Buddhist teachings, in the first scope and second scope, you learn about attachment. In the second scope, you learn about attachment. And effectively, as far as the Four Noble Truths are concerned, attachment is the main problem in the world, the cause of our suffering. But here, in the compassion wing, they talk about the main problem being self-cherishing. They are not equivalent. So you could say attachment's the main problem, this powerful emotional hunger to always get what I want that exaggerates the deliciousness and believes that'll bring me happiness. That's the delusion that is the root of the problem, that's also rooted in the root delusion, but effectively in daily life, attachment is the main problem. So what you can say is the point of self-cherishing or selfishness, it's the aspect of, on the basis of having attachment, we put self first. So it's called, the Tibetans call it self-cherishing. We just call it selfishness. So it's kind of curious. We all kind of joke about attachment, but no one likes to joke about selfish. And no one likes to admit to being selfish. You feel very offended if someone, calls you selfish. But this is the point. And this is really emphasized in the compassion wing, because the whole point of the compassion wing is to make this paradigm shift from cherishing me to cherishing others. That's the point. So it's a very specific approach in the compassion wing. So this whole approach that's expressed in the 8 verses is this radical way to smash self-cherishing. But because self-cherishing and attachment are completely related to the root delusion, ego grasping, it's putting atomic bombs under them as well. And it'll make it a lot easier for you to realize emptiness, when you can smash self-cherishing. So this 8 verses, the first one, and even this needs to be explained, It says something like, in order to get the most benefit from sentient beings, not to get the most benefit for, but it's got a very particular meaning, to get the most benefit from them. Meaning, and the Tibetans talk like this, that we rely upon suffering sentient beings. What that means is, if you're trying to cultivate compassion, if your goal is to cultivate these outrageous levels of compassion, if that's your goal, and that's the point of these 8 verses, you want to develop these outrageous levels of compassion, then of course you need to meet lots of suffering sentient beings. That, in that sense, in order to get the benefit from all these suffering sentient beings, and then it says, this is so outrageous, who are more precious than a wish-fulfilling jewel. Well, of course, that sounds a bit abstract, but why not just put $1 million there? Who are more precious to me than $1 million. I mean, what are they talking about? This is like a demented idea. If you think in terms of value, I mean, maybe a mother would say she'd rather have her baby than $1 million. Her baby is more precious than $1 million. But I don't think, unless you've got a beloved, a very special beloved, it's going to be quite hard to say that. $1 million is very delicious. Think the point. Who are more precious to me than $1 million. I will only kind of, try and think about them and be nice to them and whatever. That's the first verse. It's outrageous already. It's shocking. The second one is almost like shocking, even more shocking. They get more shocking, these verses. When you're with others, it says something like this. And when you're with others, think of yourself as the lowest of all. And, wait for it, see others as superior. This is a very kind of, for our culture, this is quite a shocking kind of context. It's quite a shocking idea, because it implies so strongly that if you're seeing others as supreme, that means I must be a creep. But it's not saying that at all. We hear it like that. It's actually meaning have incredible humility and delight in the qualities of other people. And it's a very powerful practice, because you see, the way ego grasping is, and the way attachment is, and the way self-cherishing is, they're so embedded in us, we just can't see it. We're always finding fault, aren't we, with other people? We're looking out in the world and we're always judging. A person walking down the street don't like their shoes. The person talks too loud. This person does this. Your auntie does that. Your mother does this. It's automatic that we're putting ourselves in this kind of position where I must be okay, but look at these other people. The assumption is that I'm okay, but look at these other people. It's very, I mean, it's shocking, but we do it all the time. So we're trying to reverse that. We're trying to practice. In other words, another way to put it is in delighting in another person, being more clever at something. It doesn't have to mean in general the person is more divine and you're a creep. Not like that. But I think a really good practice of this, an application of this, very real one, is with you, like at work or at home. When you think of one person and you consciously think of a particular quality that they've got, one thing that's better than you, not like, oh, she is better than me, the whole person. No, maybe she's got cuter feet. Maybe her ears are nicer. I'm not joking here. Maybe she's got, she's more intelligent. Maybe she does maths better. It's really important practice. It's a very precise thing. And you're happy for that person, that she's better than you. So it's a powerful practice of humility, of learning to see other people have got qualities that in this case are better than yours. Not to hate yourself, but to force us to switch from this constant view of always finding fault, which means putting yourself up. You might never think so, because we all think we have self-hate, but we still keep finding fault in other people. And then seeing them as supreme means simply see them as, yes, she is better at maths than me. It's a very profound practice. It's quite specific about particular things in a person, It's very amazing to do that. So to delight in it, that she's better than you at that. Rejoice in it instead of being jealous or resentful, It's very powerful. The third one is, they talk about how you're watching your mind like a hawk, and the moment a delusion arises, which will harm you and others, I will avert it without delay. I think this already tells you this person who wrote this text is a pretty advanced person. In other words, the default mode, they're implying the default mode in the mind is virtue. And all of a sudden a naughty delusion pops up. Well, I think it's the other way around for us. Delusions run the show, and occasionally you might have a virtuous thought. So this is pretty profound, to try and catch your delusions every time they rise when they're just running rampant. So we do our best. The next one, and these next three, I think they get heavier, each one. And I think the first one is a bit like sort of if you read about the world in general, and you read about some psychopath, as we call them, or a pedophile or a terrorist or something. So the first impulse is to have disgust, isn't it? And have anger towards them and criticize them. But no, our attitude here would be, as it says in the text, if you do hear about this rare, they say rare, back maybe in the 10th century, it was rare. But look at the world now, completely overwhelmed by the presence of crazy people so suffering. Then what's the attitude towards that person? You're going to think like you found a precious treasure. Why? Because every time you meet a person who's really deluded and really suffering and causing suffering, but they are suffering, it'll force you to realize, the suffering of the world, and it increases your compassion, lessens your self-cherishing. The next verse is a bit closer to home, I think. It's more like at work. If you're accused of doing something you didn't do, right? Then what are you going to do to that? You're going to take the blame and give the victory to the others. I mean, this is incredible. Even your sister said you broke that cup, and you have a panic attack, to try and defend yourself. Even if you did break the cup, you tried to defend yourself. It's too much to be found fault, it's too intense. So this one, this is powerful. To take the blame. It sounds very weird for us, but you got to be appropriate. It's got to be appropriate, and you give the victory to them. That's incredible. The next one is the most heavy of all. When a person you've sacrificed your life for, like your beloved child, your husband, who then turns against you. How are you going to see that person? As your precious guru. I mean, these are really powerful, seemingly simple, not like a emptiness where you've got to squeeze your brain to hear emptiness. These words are easy to understand, but emotionally, they're really powerful attitudes, And this is the kind of thinking we're trying to cultivate. But as Pabonga Rinpoche says, you need to be a suitable vessel. What does he mean by that? you need to have done the work in the wisdom wing, the Four Noble Truths. If you're still in a relationship where you're being bullied and abused and you have no self-esteem, this is not for you. These advices are not for you. They're too advanced. So you've got to be a suitable vessel, as Pabonka Rinpoche says. And then the next one is, I think it's a bit about emptiness. Basically, it says, anyway, that's all. That's the first 6 verses. So I need some questions now, please. I've said so much today. You need to ask me some questions, please. Come on.
So Robina, so when we're thinking about how to do these practices, this Lojong practice specifically, and you're saying, are we, we must be a suitable vessel for that. So, I mean, this is a practice I do a lot, and have had success with changing my viewpoints of people, but usually it takes a really long time and a lot of repetitions for me to get anywhere with it. So you say do your best. I mean, is that how we should be thinking about it for someone like me who, I'm definitely still on the wisdom path. I mean, that's where I'm at. So I guess am I right to keep doing these practices and just to
if you understand them properly, you know exactly what you're doing and you follow the instructions. And then of course they are. I mean, they're like powerful. Just have the thought. Even just as Rinpoche says in something in a teaching I'm editing at the moment, even you have the thought of, say, taking on someone else's suffering when you do Lojong, which we'll talk Tonglen. We'll discuss that in a second. But you then, as soon as a problem comes, you start freaking out and you can't do it. He says, don't worry, even still, just the thought is inconceivable, because it's like an opposite to delusions. It's putting atomic bombs under delusions. So of course it's powerful. But don't think you're more than you are. And so the thing is, what I'm saying by suitable vessel, people can easily misunderstand these instructions because they're literally mentally not equipped to hear it because they're so overwhelmed by their own misery. So we've got to know where we're at. So
okay. Yeah, I mean, I find that the one that I've worked with the most is the one that you said is the most difficult, that seems to be when I am drawn to that practice the most, is when I'm trying to not see someone as an enemy who has wronged me, at least relatively speaking, somehow.
Good. Okay, keep practicing. So this all leads to the 7th verse, I think, is really where Lojong Tonglen comes from. I got a feeling it's this source. He says, I will give all my happiness and everything to others. And then secretly, it says, I will take upon myself their suffering. So that's really this meditation practice. But I think in the West, there's quite a misunderstanding about it. I think people often treat it like a healing technique. So you say to do Tonglen is incredible, but it's really, the beneficiary of Tonglen is oneself. If someone's got a headache, we think, oh, I'll do Tonglen, which is marvelous that you think you're taking on their headache, which is incredible, but really you're the beneficiary of it. It's not a technique for healing. You can do healing, you do medicine, Buddha, all kinds of things for the sake of the other person's headache. The beneficiary of sitting there, visualizing, breathing in their sickness, and you happily imagining having the sickness if you could, then them, which is the taking part. And then when you breathe out, you imagine giving them all your good things and your good health and your wealth and everything else. The beneficiary of this is you. It's like you're putting atomic bombs under self-cherishing. And this is the final technique that eventually, where you make this paradigm shift, when you accomplish bodhicitta as a result, is the end result. It's a huge practice. So it's kind of curious. I find so many people really like it, really like this practice, but I wonder if we're understanding it. It's kind of shocking, because if you can't take the blame, then you can't do Tonglen. If you can't, be happy, see the pedophile and have compassion for him and think you found a precious treasure, then you can't do Tonglen. So maybe we're making a romantic idea of Tonglen, because it's the most heavy of all. Basically, I'm telling you, Tonglen would be, I said, okay, we find it easy to do Tonglen with a little doggy. But if you did Tonglen with the pedophile, that's when you really have to test whether you understand what you're doing. Because a pedophile is a person who for us is a disgusting person who harms people. But who the hell do you think they are harming more? Bodhisattvas have more compassion for the harmer than the harmed. And there's logic to that. And we understand this level of compassion, we will have the same. Why? Because the harmed, the victim, has just finished the suffering that they caused. And the harmer is just beginning countless future lives of suffering. That's the real basis of real compassion in Buddhism, based on karma. The Bodhisattvas have such compassion for us. Forget emptiness, but because the fact that we don't realize cause and effect, that we don't realize we create ourselves, that we came into this life having created the causes for all the suffering and all the happiness we have. We're always looking everywhere else for the causes. This is the greatest reason to have compassion for sentient beings. Then it's easy to have compassion for the pedophile. Then you can really do Tonglen. Then it's outrageous, you know. Any questions? There's logic to all the steps. They're not sentimental feelings, you know, there's logic to it. And it starts with karma. And that's entry level, grade 1, lowest scope. All of it grows, each on the next one. You can't understand this level of compassion if you haven't got renunciation. And you don't understand attachment. You can't get rid of attachment if you haven't got karma. It's just logical. The steps are logical. We have to see them, the logical coherence to it all. Are there any other questions, please? We have to go soon.
Hi, Robina.
Yes. Hello, sweetheart. Ruth.
Hi. Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, so I'm just gonna say the word Christianity right now.
Whatever you
I'm
want
not,
to say, whatever you
yeah.
like to talk to me.
Okay, so I'm not a Christian, but I think that some of these ideas are kind of archetypal, you know, like
Yes,
Christ on the cross, right? He's
right.
dying for our sins, you know,
That's
and it's
right.
just
Yeah.
mind-blowing. It's the
It
most
is mind-blowing,
incredible
yeah.
thing that we could think
That's
of.
right.
You know?
That's right.
So anyway, I just wanted to draw attention to that parallel. I was just thinking about it.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I'm
and
going to
then,
say. You want to ask a question? You going to ask?
I mean, I was just it's just more of a question of how to apply it, you know, and I have some situations in my life where I feel like I can, and sometimes I can, and sometimes I can't. And I'm just talking about how incredible it is. I guess it's not a question.
That's
But
okay, darling. Good. Well, Ruth, just keep moving, sweetheart. Try to hear the teachings here, wherever you get them, wherever they are, you know, and then see it to try and apply it, because they're so powerful, these techniques, that we can really apply them properly.
mhm,
Very true.
yeah. Well,
Good.
thank you for bringing
Well,
it.
sweetheart. Good, darling. Thank you so much. What else, people?
Hi, Venerable Robina. It's
Hello, darling. Who is that?
Ali.
Hi, sweetheart. Talk to me.
So you talked about practicing Tonglen for the pedophile. And so if we're able to do that, then you said it's to benefit ourselves. It's not to take away.
No,
something.
that's right. It's you. It's sort of all. Other words, all those 8 verses. It's the people out there, the one who cheats you, the one who harms you, the sentient beings themselves with all their suffering, the harmer, the people who harm you specifically. They are all grist for the mill for us to smash our delusions, because our first impulse is to have anger. Our first impulse is to have attachment. Our first impulse is to be blaming. So this is why they're powerful. Like when you meet the harmers and the suffering people, it's like you use them to smash your own self-centeredness, to smash your attachment, to smash your anger. This is the point. This is the whole point.
That was my question.
Yeah, that's the point. That's the reason for it.
To know.
You get the point.
Yes.
Good, darling. I always use the analogy. You know, I always remember I was being always impressed by what's that cyclist? He was a naughty boy for a while. Armstrong. Oh, well, she's gone away.
Yeah, I remember this one. Lance
Where is
Armstrong.
she?
Yeah.
She's run away.
Oh,
Ali
she
ran away.
ran away. She's
Come back.
still.
I'm still talking to you. I feel, for example, that Lance Armstrong, that for, you know, that kind of total obsession, for him, the higher the mountain, the happier he was. In other words, you know, if you're just trying to ride a bike, you want to go downhill, please, no effort. But when you really know that you've got to become the best cyclist, you delight in the toughest challenges, you delight in the heaviest mountain. That's that attitude. The bodhisattvas have this powerful attitude. The more difficult life brings, the more delighted they are, because it's the perfect opportunity to become a Buddha very quickly, because it's the perfect opportunity to smash the delusions which are preventing you from having all this compassion. So it's a very precise view, you know, and very fierce and very logical, and it's very heartfelt, of course. So we can all see we do not like problems, and so we'll do anything to avoid a problem, and a problem is what attachment doesn't want. So when you really can face problems, especially being harmed by others, it's the most powerful practice. It can put atomic bombs under our delusions. It really is a powerful practice. But like, again, you've got to be a suitable vessel. If a person's in a victim relationship and being abused daily and has no way of understanding what to do and is stuck in this fear and paralysis, to tell them to love their beating up husband is like demented, you know, craziness. They're not qualified. They don't even know how. They've got to have some self-respect first. Got to have the courage to leave the crazy husband first. So we've got to go one step at a time, you know. Do you understand?
And then where does the realization of emptiness come into this?
What, darling?
And where does the realization of emptiness? We talked about realization of emptiness earlier.
Yeah, there's the two specific approaches. There's the wisdom wing, which is all about the mind, the delusions, karma, and eventually shamatha, and eventually emptiness. Then you've got the compassion wing, which is all this talk about relating to sentient beings. So obviously, every time you try to think about emptiness, it loosens the grip of ego grasping explicitly, but implicitly, it helps you have love and compassion, because you're opening it up. And every time you practice the explicit practice of the compassion wing and compassion and love, that explicitly helps you get more compassion and empathy, but implicitly, it helps cut away the ego. They each help the other. They're very specific techniques. The wisdom wing is to cut the root of the delusions, and the compassion wing is to develop compassion for others. But this is this one is very, emptiness plays a powerful role. You know, it means, you know, every time you forgive the enemy, every time you have compassion for the enemy, it's completely counteracts ego grasping. So it helps you realize emptiness. But there are the specific views that bodhicitta is the way to get that one side, and emptiness is the way to get the other side, and they each help each other. Do you understand?
Mm-hmm.
Good.
And you have to do both to reach enlightenment.
You've got to do both. Bird needs two wings. You can have wisdom and you'll just zap into nirvana, into bliss for a few eons, and Buddha will come along and tap you on the shoulder, say, sorry, honey, come out of that bliss and come back on the bodhisattva path and become a Buddha. So no point wasting your time. And then if you're on, you can even lose bodhicitta. At a certain point, you can still lose bodhicitta. So emptiness is the key, you know. Do you understand?
Which is what we're talking about next week.
Oh, is that what we're going to do next week, is it?
Yes.
Okay, good. All
It's
right.
a great transition.
Okay, good. Perfect. So I think it's a bit early, but it's enough. All right. Dankshub, Rinpoche, ma ke panam ke guchi, ke panyampa me pa yang gong ne gondu paba shog, gewa di nyudu dag lama sange drub gyune, drowa chikyang malu pa de sala gopa shog. Wait a minute, I'm teaching next Tuesday, am I?
No, you're not. No, you have,
I can skip it. That's right. I'll be away. That's right. I'll be away. So next class.
We
All right,
won't
petals. All right, dearest.
But the Tuesday after. We'll see
What
you in
time?
2 weeks on Tuesday.
Good. Okay. Okay, everybody. Thank you so much. Keep moving, and never give up. Okay, everybody. Thanks, darlings. All of you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Robina.
She's out.
Thanks, you guys. So once again, we don't have class next week. Robina's traveling, but we'll be back in 2 weeks and the link will remain the same. So we hope to see you in 2 weeks. Have a lovely night. And we
Thank you.
are recording them as well, and we'll share the recording. So if you miss anything, we can catch you up. Good to see you, Ruth.
You too, Billy. Thanks.
Yeah.
See ya.
How many did we have online tonight?